The snow had melted from the fields, and spring crept in soft and shy like a stranger unsure of their welcome. The land around Daniel's ranch was waking again, creeks running, grass turning tender green, and the air filled with the smell of wet earth and hay. Inside that quiet, Evelyn had begun to breathe again. She had learned to walk through the mornings without fear, to touch the wood of the porch rail and feel it solid beneath her palms, to sleep without waking in panic at every sound that echoed from the distance. Daniel didn't speak much. He never did. But in his silence, she found a kind of safety that words could never give. Sometimes they'd share coffee before the sunrise, sitting side by side, watching the light climb over the hills. No questions, no past. Just breath and warmth and a peace too fragile to name. Still, there were moments when Evelyn would look toward the far horizon, and her eyes would grow distant, as if she could still hear the sound of the train wheels. Grinding metal, the wind tearing through her hair, the scream of betrayal that had no voice. Daniel noticed, but he never asked. He just kept building, fixing fences, mending barns, planting new rows of corn, as if the rhythm of life could fill the cracks left by what she'd lost. And in a way, it did. One evening, after a long day of work, she found herself humming while sweeping the porch. A soft, wordless tune, the kind she hadn't dared to make in years. Daniel stopped in his tracks when he heard it. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her. The way the golden light caught in her hair, the way her lips curved into something close to a smile. He didn't say anything, but when she turned and saw him there, she felt something steady, something human, something like hope. That night, they shared dinner by lamplight. The rain tapped gently against the windows, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Evelyn laughed. It startled them both. The sound was soft, unpracticed, like an instrument being played after years of silence. Daniel looked at her and said, in that slow, quiet way of his, "I like that sound." And she blushed, whispering back, "I didn't know I still had it." Outside, thunder rolled far off in the hills. A storm passing somewhere unseen. The days that followed were gentle, the kind of peace that almost makes a person forget the world beyond their fences. She mended shirts, baked bread, fed the horses, and even helped Daniel tame a young colt too wild for the stable. Sometimes when he was near, she'd feel her heart twist, a strange mix of safety and fear, like a flame she was afraid to touch but couldn't look away from. And yet, the past has a way of finding those who try hardest to forget it. It started small. A rider passing on the road, too far to make out a face, but close enough to leave a trace of dust hanging in the air. A letter left at the post office addressed to no one she knew. And once, late one night, the sound of hooves where there should have been silence. Daniel noticed the change in her before she said a word. How she lingered by the windows longer, how her laughter faded, replaced by that familiar quiet. When he asked, she shook her head. "It's nothing, just dreams." But she didn't dream. Not anymore. She remembered, and those memories came back sharp. A man's voice shouting over the wind, the flash of steel, the weightless moment before the fall. The train tracks, the smell of iron, the betrayal that left her broken in the dirt. Daniel found her one morning sitting by the creek, hands trembling, eyes far away. He didn't say her name. He just sat beside her, letting the water do the talking. After a while, she whispered, "Do you ever think peace is just something borrowed? Something that's bound to be taken back?" Daniel took a breath, watching the slow drift of the water. "Maybe," he said softly, "but I reckon it's worth holding while it lasts." She turned to him then, really looked at him. And in his eyes she saw no pity, no questions, only understanding. That night she dreamt of the train again. Only this time, when she fell, someone was waiting at the bottom, a man with kind eyes and steady hands. The next morning, Daniel found a single set of footprints leading down the road, and beside them, a second pair that hadn't been there before. Someone was watching, and peace, the little they had built together, was about to be tested in ways neither of them were ready for. The next few days carried a strange stillness across the plains, the kind of quiet that doesn't bring peace. only the sense that something is listening. The wind shifted from the west, dry and uneasy. Crows gathered along the fence posts, black specks against the bright sky, watching the ranch with their glassy eyes. Evelyn tried to keep busy. She baked, she cleaned, she brushed the horses until their coats shone. But her mind kept drifting, always back to the sound of hooves she'd heard that night. It hadn't been her imagination. She knew that rhythm, the slow and deliberate pace of a man who believed the world owed him its silence. Daniel saw her hands shake as she poured coffee that morning. He didn't ask, not right away. He just took the cup from her, steady as ever, and said, "Whatever it is, we'll face it here. Together." The word together lingered between them longer than it should have. Evelyn nodded, though her eyes still searched the horizon, as if expecting something to appear at any moment. And then one did. It was near sundown when the rider came. A tall man on a dark horse, dressed in a fine gray coat that didn't belong to ranch country. He rode slow, deliberate, like someone who wanted to be seen. Daniel was fixing the gate when he spotted him. He wiped his hands on his jeans, the kind of quiet tension crawling through his body that only men who've faced death before can recognize. The rider stopped a few yards from the porch, dismounted, and tipped his hat with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon," he said, his voice carrying that smooth, southern edge of a man who'd learned to lie without blinking. "Name's Silas Grant. I'm looking for a woman." Evelyn froze at the sound. Her breath caught, and the color drained from her face. Daniel turned slightly, watching her from the corner of his eye. He didn't need to ask. He already knew. "What business do you have with her?" Daniel asked, his tone steady. Silas smiled, glancing past him toward the porch where Evelyn stood like a ghost in her own home. "Well, seems you found something that doesn't belong to you, rancher. She ran off with something of mine, and I've come to collect." Evelyn shook her head, her voice trembling but fierce. "I don't belong to anyone, Silas." He chuckled low as if amused by the idea. "Oh, you always were good at pretending to be innocent. Tell me, did you tell this poor fool what you did before you jumped that train?" Daniel's hand tightened on the fence rail. "I think you should leave," he said, his voice low. But Silas wasn't a man who took orders from anyone, not even the Lord himself. He stepped closer, brushing dust from his coat, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "You got no idea what kind of woman you've let into your home, rancher. She's a liar, a thief. She tried to ruin me." Evelyn's voice cut through the air like a crack of thunder. "You ruined yourself, Silas. You killed men for profit, for rail lines and land that wasn't yours. You threw me from that train because I saw what you did." For a heartbeat, the air between them burned with old pain. Daniel's eyes shifted from one to the other, seeing now the truth written in both faces. And Silas, seeing his grip on fear slipping, smiled thinly. "Well," he said softly, "ain't this touching? You think you can start over, do you? You think the world forgets?" He leaned forward, his eyes dark and cruel. "The past doesn't die, sweetheart. It just rides slower." Daniel took one step forward, calm, unshaken. "I'm not going to tell you again. Get off this land." For a moment, the two men stood there, staring, the quiet kind of stare where death waits for the smallest excuse to step in. Silas smirked again, then turned to his horse. But before he mounted, he looked back at Evelyn. "You've got till sundown tomorrow to give me what I came for," he said. "Or I'll take it from both of you." And then he rode off, slow, deliberate, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the dying light. Evelyn sank to her knees the moment he was gone. Daniel was beside her in an instant, his rough hand finding hers, his voice low. "What does he want, Evelyn?" She looked up at him, her eyes full of tears she hadn't let fall in years. "The truth," she whispered. "And if he can't have that, he'll settle for blood." The sun sank fast that evening, dragging the light down with it like a wounded beast. The air grew heavy, and the smell of rain mixed with something darker. The kind of scent that told the land a storm was coming. But it wasn't the sky that worried Daniel. It was the man who'd promised to return. Inside the small ranch house, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, a candle burning low beside her. The flame flickered against her face, tracing shadows of old memories she couldn't escape. Her hands were clasped tight, not in prayer, but in the desperate stillness of someone who's run too far to fall apart. Daniel stood by the window, rifle resting against the wall, eyes on the horizon. Neither had spoken much since Silas left. There was nothing left to say that didn't already hang in the air between them. When Evelyn finally broke the silence, her voice was thin, trembling but steady. "I thought he'd never find me," she said. "I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, the past would stop looking." Daniel turned slowly, his eyes calm but hard. "You don't owe him anything," he said. "Not your fear, not your peace. Not anymore." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw in him a kind of strength that wasn't born of pride, but of loss. He had known what it meant to fight for something after it was already broken. "I never told you why I was on that train," she whispered. Daniel shook his head. "You don't have to. I do," she said. "Because it'll come for us both now." She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the candle's flame. "I worked for the railroad, the office that handled land rights. I found papers, proof that Silas had been stealing from settlers, selling land twice, taking bribes. I was going to tell someone, the governor's men, but he found out. He put me on that train, said he'd send me west for inspection work. Then halfway through the canyon line, he threw me off." Daniel's hands clenched at his sides, the wood of the window frame creaking under his grip. He wanted to speak, to curse, to promise vengeance, but words felt small against something that cruel. Instead, he crossed the room and took her hand, rough against soft. "You survived," he said quietly. "That's what matters," but she shook her head. "He doesn't care about the papers anymore. He just wants to make sure I never speak again." Outside, thunder rolled, distant, but coming closer. The horses in the stable began to stir, uneasy. Daniel checked his rifle, loaded each round with slow precision. He moved like a man who had done this before. Not for glory, not for anger, but for necessity. Evelyn watched him from the doorway, her heart twisting with something she couldn't name. She'd been thrown away once, left for dead. Now someone was standing between her and that darkness, and it frightened her almost as much as it healed her. As night fell, the rain came. It drummed against the roof, soft at first, then hard enough to drown the silence between lightning flashes. Daniel sat by the window, rifle across his knees, eyes steady on the night. Evelyn tried to rest, but sleep refused her. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind sounded like hooves on wet ground. Around midnight, a shadow moved by the barn. Daniel was on his feet before the dogs even barked. He stepped out into the rain, slow and silent, boots sinking into the mud. Lightning flashed, and for an instant, the world turned white, revealing 3 horses tied behind the fence, and men moving in the dark. It wasn't just Silas. He had brought help. Daniel slipped behind the water trough, watching. One man carried a lantern, another a shovel, and Silas, tall, deliberate, was directing them with quiet authority. Through the rain, Daniel caught the glint of something metallic in Silas's hand. A pistol, polished and waiting. He backed away toward the house, moving like a shadow himself. Inside, Evelyn was already standing barefoot, a revolver in her trembling hands. "They're here," Daniel said softly. "I know," she whispered. "I heard them." He nodded once, calm. "Stay behind me. If anything happens, ride for the hills. Don't look back." Her eyes filled, her voice shaking. "I'm not leaving you." He looked at her then. Not as a stranger he'd saved, but as someone who had become the only light in a life of dust and silence. "Evelyn, please." But she only shook her head. "I've run enough, Daniel. I'm done running." And with that, she stepped closer, her hand brushing his. And for the first time, he let himself touch her. Just a brief trembling moment. 2 broken souls standing in the doorway, facing the storm that had finally found them. Outside, the lightning split the sky. And in the distance, Silas Grant smiled beneath his hat, because he knew by morning this land would burn. The wind came first, rolling down from the distant ridges like a whisper of something unfinished. It swept across the valley, stirring the wheat fields and bending the lonely silhouettes of cottonwoods that lined the creek. Inside the ranch house, silence reigned, the kind that speaks of hearts too heavy to make sound. Evelyn sat by the window, her pale fingers tracing the rain-streaked glass, her mind wandering to places she wished she could forget. Behind her, the old clock ticked steadily, like the heartbeat of a home that wasn't sure if it still believed in peace. Outside, Thomas was checking the fences, his coat flapping in the wind, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had learned long ago that storms in the west never came alone. They brought more than rain. They brought memories, regrets. And sometimes, men, that night the storm broke in full. Thunder cracked open the sky, and the wind howled through the plains like a wounded coyote. Evelyn lit a lantern, her trembling hand casting shadows across the cabin walls. She'd been restless all day, haunted by the letter she found tucked beneath the porch rail, one sealed in wax with her name scrawled across it. She hadn't told Thomas about it. Not yet. When he finally came in, soaked to the bone, his eyes found hers, and he knew something was wrong. "You're shaken, Eve," he said softly, setting his hat on the table. "What's happened?" She held the letter out to him. "It came this morning. No one saw who left it. Thomas took it, broke the seal, and unfolded the damp paper." His jaw tightened as he read the words, "You can't hide from the past." Not even behind a rancher's kindness, there was no signature. But the handwriting, sharp, slanted, deliberate, was one Evelyn recognized. Her breath hitched. "It's him," she whispered. "The one who threw me from that train." The words fell heavy between them. Thomas looked at her, eyes dark and unreadable. "How could he know where you are?" "I don't know," she said, voice breaking. "But he does. And if he's found me once?" Thomas reached for his rifle, the old Winchester that had hung above the door since before the war. "He won't get near you." "Not while I'm still breathing." But Evelyn knew the West better than that. Evil didn't knock at your door. It crept in with the rain, waited by the corral, and smiled when you turned your back. For days, the ranch felt different. The wind carried a strange weight, and every hoofbeat echoed like a warning. Evelyn tried to keep busy, feeding the hens, tending to the horses. But her thoughts wandered to the man who had taken everything from her and might come to take more. One evening, as the sun bled over the plains, she found Thomas sitting on the porch, his hat low, eyes fixed on the distance. He didn't turn when she stepped outside. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. "Leaving? This place. This valley. Starting fresh somewhere far away." She hesitated. "Wouldn't matter how far we ran." "Some ghosts. They follow the heart, not the trail." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time we stop running." That night neither of them slept. And when the first light of dawn crept across the valley, they saw it. A dark figure on horseback, standing motionless at the edge of the hill, watching the ranch. Evelyn's heart turned to ice. Thomas stood beside her, rifle in hand. "Looks like your past came to visit." The rider didn't move, didn't speak, only watched. Then with a slow turn, he rode away into the mist. But they both knew what that meant. The storm hadn't passed. It had only begun. Evelyn looked at Thomas, her eyes glistening with a mix of fear and fury. "If he comes back," she said, voice trembling but firm, "I won't hide again." Thomas nodded once, solemnly. "Then we'll face him together." And as the morning sun broke through the clouds, the two of them stood there, two souls bound by pain and by the strange, fierce tenderness that only the West could forge. The kind that blooms in dust, endures in blood, and survives even when hope is nothing but smoke. The morning came dressed in silence, the kind that feels sacred and final. The air carried a chill that spoke of endings, of things that must break before the world can start again. Thomas had been up since before dawn, saddling his horse, checking the Winchester's chamber, watching the light spill slowly over the land he'd built with his bare hands. He could feel it in his bones. Today would demand something from him, something that couldn't be taken back. Evelyn stood by the corral, her hair loose, the hem of her dress brushing the dust. She looked at him with that quiet strength he had come to know, the kind that never needed to be loud to be brave. "You don't have to face him alone," she said softly. Thomas turned to her, eyes tired but steady. "I ain't facing him for me. I'm facing him because he took your peace." And I can't live in a world where he still breathes, knowing what he did to you." Evelyn stepped closer, her hand trembling as it brushed his arm. "If you kill him, it won't bring it back. It won't erase what happened on that train. No," he said quietly. "But maybe it'll stop the scream that's been echoing in my chest every time I look at you and see what the world did." They didn't speak after that. There was nothing left to say. By the time the sun burned gold across the horizon, the rider appeared again. The same shadow from the hill, now real and close. His horse kicked up the dust of Hollow Creek, and when he came within sight, Thomas could see his face, scarred, smirking, cruel. Evelyn's breath caught. The memories hit her like a blow, flashing steel, the cold air of that night on the train, and the sound of laughter as she fell into the dark. The man dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the dirt. "You've been hiding behind this rancher," he said, voice like gravel. "Didn't think you'd have the nerve to face me again." Thomas stepped forward, his rifle hanging loosely at his side. "You made a mistake coming here," the man chuckled. "I made plenty, but I always finish what I start." Evelyn's hand tightened on Thomas's sleeve. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't let him drag you into his darkness." But the West had its own law, one written not on paper, but in dust and blood. And Thomas knew that sometimes peace had a price. The two men faced each other beneath the open sky. No words left, only the rhythm of the wind, the crackle of dry grass, the thud of a heartbeat that belonged to both of them. When the shot came, it was sudden, loud and final. A single echo rolled through the valley like thunder. For a moment, time stopped. Then, slowly, the man who had thrown Evelyn from the train staggered backward, clutching his chest. He looked up, eyes wide in disbelief, as the life drained from him. And before he hit the ground, his gaze found Evelyn, just for an instant. There was no anger there. No plea, only emptiness. Thomas stood motionless, the rifle lowering in his hand. His breath came heavy, his heart trembling in the quiet aftermath of violence. Evelyn walked to him, her steps slow, her eyes filled with tears. Not for the man who lay dead, but for everything that had led them here, for the innocence stolen, the love found, and the peace that now came wrapped in grief. Thomas looked at her, his voice breaking. "It's done," she nodded. "Yes, but it doesn't end here, Thomas. It ends when we start living again." He stared out at the plains, the sky turning pale pink over Hollow Creek, the wind carrying away the smell of gunpowder. "I don't know how," he whispered. She took his hand. "Then let's learn together." They buried the man at the edge of the valley, where the earth was hard and the sun rose slow. No marker, no name, just a mound of dirt, soon to be swallowed by time. When the work was done, Thomas sat beside her on the porch, watching the horizon fade into gold. The pain didn't vanish, it never does, but it softened, like a wound finally starting to close. Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder. "You found me when I had nothing left," she murmured. "Now maybe it's my turn to help you find what's next." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile born from exhaustion and hope tangled together. "Guess we're both starting over." The last light of day fell across the valley, wrapping them in quiet peace. And as the wind whispered through the grass, carrying the promise of tomorrow, the ghosts that had haunted them finally began to fade. Because in the end, the West always takes something, but it also gives something back. And for Evelyn and Thomas, what it gave was simple: a chance to begin again beneath the same sun that had once watched them fall.